This video is designed to give some basic information about why and how to measure the vocabularies of English language learners, as well as to learn the difference between receptive and expressive vocabulary knowledge. ESOL teachers, especially in the intermediate and secondary context, often measure the vocabulary level of students. The most commonly used tests are designed according to how common a word is within the English language. One example of a vocabulary levels test is shown. The words tested for at the 1,000 word level represent the most frequently used word families, which account for about 80% of English. At the 2,000 word level, the next most commonly used words are tested for, which make up around 4 to 10% of English words, and so on throughout the test. A commonly asked question is, what vocabulary size do students need? Paul Nation from Victoria University is a world-leading researcher in the area of vocabulary. In a research article from 2006, he asked the question, how large a receptive vocabulary is needed for typical language use, like reading a novel, reading a newspaper, watching a movie, and taking part in a conversation. To be sure that the text is able to be understood, 98% of the words included should be known. Through this research, it was found that an 8,000 to 9,000 word family vocabulary was needed to reach the 98% coverage mark for a text such as a novel or a newspaper. To be able to understand spoken information, 6,000 to 7,000 word family vocabulary was needed. Thus, we can take from this that it is important that a student's vocabulary is growing all the time in order to reach this level by their secondary school years. Keep in mind also that at secondary school, students will need to learn a wide range of subject-specific vocabulary. For example, the very specific words used in science or mathematics. These types of words are infrequent in their usage in English and belong to even higher vocabulary levels. It's important to note that Nation's 2006 research was based on receptive use of language. That is, the ability to read or hear information and understand it. Expressive use of language follows on from the receptive and is the stage where students are using the language as they speak and write. The vocabulary levels test shown earlier tests for receptive language knowledge. Students usually have a larger receptive language vocabulary size than they do expressive language. Vocabulary is generally also divided into two levels, BICS and CALP. BICS stands for Basic Interpersonal Communication Skills, and CALP, Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency, as theorized by Cummins in 1979. The lower vocabulary levels represent the language required for everyday contexts, whereas the higher vocabulary levels begin to address the more academic language required in school and beyond. In general, it is understood that repeated exposures to a word are required for the word to become part of your vocabulary. Researchers have estimated that around 17 exposures are required, which Cummins recommends should be at increasingly spaced time intervals. That is, when you meet a word, you should engage with it frequently at first, but then revisit it over ever-expanding periods of time to make sure you don't forget it. Also, it's worth noting that research has shown that it takes between 1 and 3 years for BICS to become part of a person's language acquisition skills, whereas CALP can take up to about 5 to 7 years to develop. So it can be useful to know the vocabulary levels of your learners. If students don't know the first 2,000 words of English, their basic interpersonal language skills will be greatly challenged. Keeping in mind that students need to know words up to the 7th, 8th and 9,000 word range to be able to read novels and newspapers. And this means that a purposeful focus on vocabulary could be needed to prepare some students for the challenges of secondary school. A good vocabulary program will be carefully designed to allow repeated exposures to words at increasingly spaced time intervals.